All right, this is the fourth of 5 senses that we're going to be talking about, and this is our second chemoreceptor sense, the sense of smell. And I got a big picture of a dog nose here because dogs clearly are the masters of this sense of smell. The way a dog processes smells is, there are different estimates, but it's at least 10,000 times as acute as our sense of smell. And before you start feeling inferior to your dog, probably your sense of vision is about 10,000 times as acute as your dog's sense of vision. So we're a good team. Dogs are great at smelling, humans are great at seeing, and together, probably why we domesticated dogs. So our sense of smell, it is a chemical sense, chemoreceptors, and I wanted to orient you back to the anatomy of what we're talking about. There are two pictures on this slide. Let's start by looking at the one that's on the top, right? So we're looking at this one right here. So you see the skull, and this bone here, that bone is the ethmoid bone, right? And the ethmoid bone, do you remember the cribriform plate? The cribriform plate is that thin piece of bone that had the little holes in it. And the reason it has those little holes is because of your sense of smell. Let's look a little bit more here. So this is the nose, right? Here we've got nasal sinus, there's a nasal sinus, and what they're depicting here is the cribriform plate. And let's zoom in really close. Now we're looking at the picture on the bottom. Right here, this is part of the cribriform plate, and laying on top of the cribriform plate, those are our olfactory bulbs. You just did that on the lab midterm, right? And the olfactory bulbs are the part of the brain that are going to be receiving the information from our sense of smell. And just barely on the other side of that cribriform plate, that piece of bone, we've got this whole layer of the chemoreceptor cells that give you your sense of smell. Oh, by the way, this is a good time for us to review our understanding of the way the senses are hooked up. Let's do a review of that. We have got sensory receptor cells that could be chemoreceptor, mechanoreceptor, photoreceptor, and they are attached to sensory neurons. Sensory neurons take the information from the sensory receptor cell to the brain, and then the brain will process it with its integration functions. And if any action needs to be taken, that would be sent out through motor neurons, right? So people have got a good number of sensory receptor cells that allow us to detect smell up there in our nose, but dogs have about 40 times as many as they do. So you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, they've got 40 times as many cells. How can you say they've got 10,000 to 100,000 times as much smelling ability or talent? And the reason is the chunk of brain that they dedicate to perceiving smell. So humans, out of all of our sensory processing, we don't dedicate, somewhere around 2/3 of it to processing vision, and only about 10% of it to processing smell. Dogs are kind of the opposite. They dedicate a huge chunk, like about 2/3, to processing smell, to the perception of smell, and they only dedicate a small portion to the processing of vision. And that's why they're much more focused on smell than vision, and we're very much focused on vision more than smell. Another advantage that dogs have is that they have got more unique protein receptor molecules on their chemoreceptor cells in their noses. So there are some chemicals that literally you could be just concentrating those chemicals in the air like crazy, and a human couldn't smell them at all because we just don't have a receptor for that. But dogs can smell some chemicals that we can't smell at all. And that leads to one interesting thing. So here's something that dogs are able to do with their very massively expanded sense of smell. They can diagnose cancer. Now, originally, this was just something that was called anecdotal evidence, Anecdotal evidence explains the kind of scientific evidence where dermatologists have agree that there have been times, often more than once, when a patient has come to them and said, "Hey doc, could you check out this little mole here? Because my dog, he keeps putting his little cold nose on it all the time. It's annoying, could you check it out?" And dermatologists have come to recognize that, oh, that means they should take it off because it might be a bad kind of cancer called melanoma. But that is anecdotal evidence, right? It's something that you've heard, something that happens, not good enough for real science, right? But it was good enough for someone to actually try and do the scientific experiment. So scientists did actually test under scientific conditions whether dogs could diagnose cancer, and they did find that they could diagnose melanoma, that's a bad kind of skin cancer, lung cancer, and breast cancer. And the way they did lung cancer and breast cancer is they had patients exhale into a little plastic chamber that had a piece of gauze in it, and the smells would get trapped in the gauze, and then later the dogs were allowed to sniff these different pieces of gauze and diagnose cancer. And they actually did a really good job on diagnosing lung cancer and breast cancer. So I know I'm the kind of person that's like, yeah, let's just train a bunch of dogs and that'd be so fun. No, they're not doing that. But what this does show is that scientists know that if dogs can do it, then theoretically they should be able to create a machine that could do it as well. So scientists are working to develop a machine that when you go into your doctor's office once a year, you would just exhale into the machine and the machine would diagnose whether there's a risk that you've got lung cancer or breast cancer. And if there is, then they could do more intensive diagnostic work to see if that's true. So here is just another image showing the cribriform plate there. Here in yellow, that is the olfactory bulb that's receiving the information. This area in purple, that's inside of your nose. The distance from inside your nose, where those are supposed to be little smell molecules down there, to a part of your brain is a super short distance. Also, our sense of smell is our sense that it goes directly into our brain for processing. Our other senses, they go through a part of the brain called the thalamus as a rooting system before it ends up going to the brain. And we think that's one reason why our sense of smell is such a primal sense and has such a good memory. All right, so your sense of smell, what kind of receptors does it rely on? You don't even have to think twice now. Chemoreceptors, all right? So now we're going to our photoreceptor sense.